Look, I need to tell someone about this absolute disaster that just destroyed my entire life. And honestly, you're probably going to think I'm the villain here, but whatever. I'm Avery. I'm 26, and I just watched my best friend Sabrina completely lose her mind and take me down with her. I'm sitting here in my apartment, unemployed and basically blacklisted from my entire industry, and I still can't believe how fast everything went to hell. Sabrina and I have been tight since college, like finishing each other's sentences, knowing each other's coffee orders, the whole deal. When we both got hired at the same company after graduation, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Finally, someone who actually gets me in this corporate hellscape. Sabrina works in project coordination while I handle administrative stuff. So, we never really competed for the same positions, which kept things chill between us. The company does government contract work. Nothing exciting, but decent pay and solid benefits. Sabrina's always been the ambitious one, constantly checking job boards and talking about climbing the ladder. I'm more about keeping my head down and collecting my paycheck. Between you and me, I've always admired how driven she is. Even when she gets a little intense about promotions and opportunities, she's constantly networking and taking online courses to make herself more competitive, which honestly made me feel kind of lazy sometimes. There's this guy, Julian, who works in Sabrina's department as a senior analyst. Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but he's always been polite when we've crossed paths. Sabrina mentioned him a few times as being smart and good at his job. Nothing more than that. I never really paid attention to him until this whole mess started. Our company has partnerships with international offices and occasionally they send someone abroad for year-long assignments. Sabrina's been obsessing over getting one of these positions for months, constantly asking our supervisor about upcoming opportunities. She even started taking language classes to make herself more competitive, which I thought was pretty smart. When the latest overseas position got posted last month, Sabrina was practically vibrating with excitement. London office, better pay, international experience, everything she'd been working toward. She spent weeks on her application, asking me to proofread everything multiple times. I was genuinely rooting for her because I know how badly she wanted it, and honestly, she deserved good things after working so hard. But then Julian applied too, and suddenly Sabrina's whole energy shifted. She started making these comments about how he probably only applied because he knew she wanted it, and how unfair it was that men always seem to get these opportunities handed to them. I tried to stay neutral because I didn't know enough about either of their qualifications to have an opinion. The tension between them became obvious pretty quickly, even though they kept things professional on the surface. Sabrina would come to lunch and vent about how Julian was probably going to get it just because he's a guy, and how the company always favors men for international assignments. I listened and tried to be supportive, but part of me wondered if she was overthinking it. The whole situation was making our usually fun lunch breaks kind of stressful, and I just wanted things to go back to normal. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how worked up she was getting about the whole thing. Sabrina's competitive streak has always been intense, but this felt different, more personal, more desperate. She was taking it as some kind of personal attack rather than just normal workplace competition. 2 weeks later, Julian got the London position, and Sabrina completely lost her mind. I've never seen her so angry and devastated at the same time. She came to my desk that afternoon with tears streaming down her face, saying the whole selection process was rigged and that Julian didn't deserve it. Seeing her that upset genuinely broke my heart because I know how much she'd wanted this opportunity. She kept saying things like, "I can't believe they picked him over me, and this company doesn't value women at all." I spent over an hour trying to comfort her, but she was spiraling hard. That evening, she called me crying and ranting about how unfair everything was, and I stayed on the phone with her for hours, just letting her vent. The next few days were brutal to watch. Sabrina was barely speaking to anyone at work, and when she did interact with Julian, you could practically see the hatred radiating off her. She started making these passive-aggressive comments during team meetings about certain people getting opportunities they didn't earn. It was getting awkward for everyone in their department, and I kept telling her she needed to let it go and focus on the next opportunity. But Sabrina wasn't hearing it. She was completely fixated on the injustice of it all. Then, about a week after Julian got the job, something shifted in Sabrina's whole demeanor. She stopped being openly angry and started getting this calculating look that I'd seen before when she was plotting something back in college. She began asking me weird questions about workplace harassment policies and whether I knew anything about Julian's personal life. I thought she was just processing her disappointment differently, so I didn't think much of it initially, but then she started staying late at the office, claiming she was catching up on work, and she stopped wanting to grab our usual lunches together. When I asked if she was okay, she'd just say she was working on something and change the subject. The whole thing was giving me bad vibes, but I figured she was just going through a rough patch. Last Friday, Sabrina asked me to grab drinks after work, which felt like progress toward getting back to normal. We went to this little place near our office, and after a couple glasses of wine, she started opening up about her plan. At first, I thought she was just venting again, but then she got really specific about how she was going to make Julian pay for stealing her opportunity. She said she'd been documenting every interaction they'd had and was building a case that he'd been inappropriate with her. I actually laughed at first because I thought she was just talking crazy, but her expression was dead serious. She told me she'd been setting up situations where Julian would be alone with her, trying to get him to say or do something she could report. When I realized she wasn't joking, I got really uncomfortable and tried to change the subject, but Sabrina kept going. She explained how she'd already started dropping hints to other coworkers about feeling uncomfortable around Julian, and how if she could get him fired for harassment, the London position would probably go to the runner-up, which was her. The whole conversation made my stomach turn, and I told her she was being insane and needed to let it go. She got defensive and said I didn't understand how hard it was to be a woman in corporate America, and that sometimes you have to play dirty to get ahead. I ended up leaving early because I couldn't handle listening to her plot against someone who, as far as I knew, hadn't actually done anything wrong. This past Monday, Sabrina put her plan into action, and I watched the whole thing unfold like a complete train wreck. She volunteered to work late on a project that she knew Julian was also staying for, making sure they'd be alone in the office. The next morning, she came to me looking all shaken up, claiming that Julian had made advances on her the night before. She said he'd cornered her in the break room and made inappropriate comments about how she looked and how they should get to know each other better now that they'd be working together more. According to Sabrina, he'd also been sending her messages that could be interpreted as flirtatious. When she showed me the screenshots on her phone, I have to admit they looked questionable. Julian asking if she wanted to grab coffee sometime, and saying she seemed really smart and interesting. But honestly, reading them, they just seemed like normal, friendly coworker messages to me. Nothing that screamed harassment. I told Sabrina that maybe she was reading too much into innocent interactions, but she insisted that I didn't understand the context and how uncomfortable he'd made her feel. She said she'd already scheduled a meeting with HR for that afternoon and wanted me to be her witness about how weird Julian had been acting around her lately. I felt sick about the whole thing, but Sabrina kept saying that Julian had crossed a line and that she had every right to report him. She also mentioned that several other women in the office had apparently noticed his inappropriate behavior, too, though she was vague about who these women were and what they'd witnessed. The way she talked about it made it sound like Julian was some kind of predator, but that didn't match up with the quiet, professional guy I'd observed for the past 2 years. When Sabrina went to HR that afternoon, she painted this picture of Julian as someone who'd been systematically making her uncomfortable for weeks. She claimed he'd been finding excuses to work closely with her, making personal comments about her appearance and creating a hostile work environment. She presented those text messages as evidence of his inappropriate interest in her and talked about how stressed and anxious his behavior was making her. HR took it seriously, which they should if someone's genuinely being harassed. But something about the whole situation felt wrong to me. Within hours, word had spread through the office that Julian was being investigated for harassment. People started looking at him differently, whispering when he walked by, and generally treating him like he was radioactive. I felt horrible watching him try to do his job while everyone was side-eyeing him and avoiding him. Meanwhile, Sabrina was playing the victim perfectly, accepting sympathy from coworkers and talking about how brave she was for speaking up. She kept thanking me for being so supportive, even though I'd barely said anything, and was actually feeling more sick about it by the hour. The worst part was seeing how confident she was that her plan was working. She'd swing by my desk and give me these little updates about the investigation, like she was keeping score in some twisted game. She mentioned that HR was taking her allegations very seriously and that Julian's London assignment was being reviewed pending the outcome of their investigation. I started avoiding her because I couldn't stand watching her manipulation in action, knowing that she was destroying someone's career over a job rejection. The HR investigation started moving faster than Sabrina expected, and cracks began showing in her story almost immediately. What she didn't anticipate was how thorough corporate investigations actually are, especially when someone's career and a prestigious international assignment are on the line. The company brought in an external investigator, and they started interviewing everyone who worked closely with both Sabrina and Julian. When they interviewed me, I tried to stay neutral, but I couldn't bring myself to outright lie when they asked specific questions about what I'd witnessed. I told them I'd never personally seen Julian behave inappropriately, but that Sabrina had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him recently. The investigator asked detailed questions about when these conversations happened and what exactly Sabrina had said, and I realized my vague answers weren't really supporting her story the way she'd expected. They also pulled security footage from the office, including the break room where Sabrina claimed the main incident occurred. Apparently, the timestamps didn't match up with her account of when things happened, and the footage showed their interaction lasting only a few minutes with completely normal body language. Sabrina started getting nervous when she heard about the security cameras, and she came to me asking if I thought she should clarify some details of her story. She tried to frame it like she'd been so traumatized that she'd gotten some timeline confused, but I could tell she was scrambling to keep her lies straight. The investigator also interviewed Julian, and apparently, he was completely blindsided by the allegations. He provided his own timeline of interactions with Sabrina, including screenshots of their full-text conversations that showed the messages she'd presented were taken completely out of context. The messages she'd claimed were inappropriate were actually part of longer conversations about work projects, and his invitation to coffee was clearly in a group context with other coworkers. When Sabrina found out about Julian's evidence, she started changing her story again, saying he was probably deleting the really bad messages and that his whole innocent act was just manipulation. She began painting him as this calculated predator who was smart enough to cover his tracks, which made her allegations harder to prove, but also more serious. The whole thing was spiraling completely out of control, and I could see that Sabrina was in way over her head. By Thursday, other coworkers were being interviewed, and it became clear that nobody else had witnessed the behavior Sabrina described. In fact, several people mentioned that Julian was always professional, and that Sabrina had seemed fine around him until very recently. A couple of people even mentioned that Sabrina had been asking them leading questions about Julian's behavior, like she was trying to get them to say something negative about him. The investigator apparently found this pattern suspicious and started digging deeper into Sabrina's motivations. When they discovered that Sabrina had been the runner-up for Julian's London position, the whole thing started looking like retaliation rather than genuine harassment. Sabrina panicked when she realized the investigation wasn't going her way, and she started reaching out to me constantly, wanting to coordinate our stories and make sure we were on the same page about what had happened. But I was starting to see how manipulative she'd been throughout this entire process, and it was making me question everything about our friendship. Friday morning, everything fell apart for Sabrina in spectacular fashion. The external investigator had apparently found security footage that completely contradicted her story, and they'd also discovered digital evidence that she'd been planning this whole thing for weeks. It turns out that Sabrina had been researching harassment policies and looking up legal advice online long before making her report, and her search history painted a clear picture of premeditation. She'd also been saving screenshots and emails in a way that suggested she was building a case rather than genuinely feeling threatened. When HR called Sabrina in for a follow-up interview, they confronted her with all of this evidence. According to what I heard later, she initially tried to stick to her story, but when they showed her the security footage and her own search history, she broke down and admitted that she'd exaggerated some details because she was upset about not getting the London position. She tried to frame it like she genuinely felt uncomfortable, but had maybe misinterpreted Julian's intentions. But the investigators weren't buying her backpedaling at all. The company was furious about the false allegations, especially since they'd already started the process of pulling Julian's international assignment, and his reputation had been damaged throughout the office. Sabrina was immediately suspended pending their own investigation into her conduct, and they started looking into whether she'd violated company policies around false reporting and retaliation. The news spread through the office like wildfire, and suddenly Sabrina went from being seen as a brave victim to being viewed as a manipulative liar who'd tried to destroy someone's career over petty jealousy. When she called me that evening, she was a complete mess, crying and saying that everyone was turning against her and that the company was making her look like the bad guy. She kept insisting that Julian had still made her feel uncomfortable, even if she couldn't prove harassment, and that the company was just protecting him because he was male. She wanted me to make a statement supporting her character, but I told her I couldn't do that after what she'd put Julian through. She got angry and said I was abandoning her just like everyone else, and that I'd never understand what it was like to have opportunities stolen from me because of my gender. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me. And honestly, I felt relieved that I didn't have to keep pretending to support what she'd done. Over the weekend, I heard through mutual friends that Sabrina had been contacting other coworkers, trying to get them to support her version of events and claiming that the company was engaged in some kind of cover-up to protect Julian. She was also apparently considering hiring a lawyer and threatening to sue for wrongful termination if they fired her. The whole situation had become this toxic mess that was affecting everyone in our department. And I realized that Sabrina's selfishness had damaged way more than just Julian's career. Julian, meanwhile, had been cleared of all allegations and was supposed to start his London assignment next month. But the whole ordeal had obviously taken a toll on him. I felt horrible about my role in everything, even though I'd never actively supported Sabrina's lies. I should have spoken up earlier when I knew what she was planning, but I'd been too worried about damaging our friendship to do the right thing. 2 weeks later, Sabrina was terminated for filing false harassment claims, violating company ethics policies, and attempting to manipulate an investigation. The company also banned her from being eligible for rehire and indicated they would provide accurate references if future employers called, which basically meant her career in our industry was completely over. She tried to spin it on social media as being punished for speaking up, but most people who knew the real story weren't buying her victim narrative anymore. Julian got his London position back, but the whole experience had clearly shaken him, and he decided to transfer to a different department when he returned from his assignment to avoid any ongoing drama. The company also implemented new policies around false reporting and investigation procedures, partly because of the mess Sabrina had created. What really shocked me was finding out that this wasn't Sabrina's first time manipulating situations to get what she wanted. After she was fired, other coworkers started sharing stories about times when Sabrina had twisted situations or thrown people under the bus for her own benefit. Apparently, she'd gotten a previous coworker in trouble by exaggerating a mistake they'd made, and she'd also taken credit for other people's work on multiple occasions. I realized that I'd been completely blind to her true character because I'd wanted to believe that my best friend was a good person. The worst part was discovering that Sabrina had been bad-mouthing me to other coworkers throughout this whole ordeal, claiming that I was jealous of her ambition and that I'd never supported her career goals. She'd apparently told people that I was a typical basic girl who was content with mediocrity and didn't understand what it took to succeed in corporate America. Finding out that she'd been talking about me like that behind my back while using me as her supposed support system was the final nail in the coffin of our friendship. 3 months later, I heard that Sabrina had moved to a different state and was working retail while trying to rebuild her career. She'd apparently burned so many bridges in our industry that nobody would hire her for professional positions anymore. She tried reaching out to me a few times through social media, alternating between apologies and accusations that I'd abandoned her when she needed me most. I never responded because I'd finally realized that Sabrina was the kind of person who would destroy anyone who got in the way of what she wanted, including me. The whole experience taught me that some people are just fundamentally selfish and will use any relationship or situation to their advantage. Sabrina had spent years building this friendship with me, not because she genuinely cared about me, but because having a loyal friend made her life easier and gave her someone to manipulate when she needed support. When I think about how close I came to getting dragged down with her, it makes me sick. If I'd been stupid enough to lie for her during the investigation, I could have lost my job too, and destroyed my own reputation. Sabrina's downfall was ultimately her own doing. Her greed, her willingness to destroy innocent people, and her complete inability to accept that she wasn't entitled to everything she wanted. She got exactly what she deserved. And honestly, I'm glad I got to see her true character before she had a chance to really damage my life. The friendship was built on lies anyway, since I had apparently never actually known who she really was underneath all the manipulation and fake loyalty.